WNYC Studios is supported by Forward. Waiting months for a 10-minute doctor's appointment? Healthcare is backwards. Luckily, Forward is here to clear things up with on-demand access to great care backed by the latest tech and top-rated doctors. Learn more at goforward.com. That's goforward.com. WNYC Studios is supported by Beacon Press, publisher of Nice Racism by Robin DiAngelo. In this follow-up to her bestseller, White Fragility, DiAngelo explores how progressive white people perpetuate racial harm. Available in hardcover, ebook, and audio.
Listener supported. WNYC Studios.
You are listening to All of It on WNYC. I'm Allison Stewart. We're dedicating our show today to the life and work of Frederick Douglass. Today marks the anniversary of a powerful speech Douglass made at an Independence Day celebration, during which he asked, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" On July 5th, Frederick Douglass gave a keynote address at an event in Rochester, New York, commemorating the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Let's listen to another excerpt of the speech read by actor James Earl Jones.
What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes that would disgrace a nation of savages. There's not a nation of the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour.
Now we turn to Professor David Blight, who joined us to discuss his biography, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, as part of our full bio series. It won the Pulitzer in 2018 and was released in paperback earlier this year. There are moments when the history of Douglass's family life reads like a prestige TV drama. There are lawsuits, difficult marriages, and tragedies. Anna Murray Douglass had 5 children with Frederick. Only 4 survived into adulthood. Douglass insisted his sons fight in the Civil War. His daughter married a man who did not like her father at all and tried to publicly disgrace him. Douglass helped his children secure good jobs, a move that was controversial and bordered on nepotism. He was there for his children. At some point, they all relied on their father for financial support. His wife, Anna, didn't really rely on Douglass for comfort or company, as he was rarely home. He found intellectual companionship outside of the marriage with several different women at different levels of intensity. He was a man of letters, and Anna could not read and never learned. But despite the obstacles, they were married for more than 40 years. I began this part of our conversation by asking David Blight why Frederick and Anna decided to marry.
Well, he meets Anna probably when he was about 18 in Baltimore. Could have met her even a bit before that. She was free, although they were born out on the Eastern Shore, probably only 3 miles from each other. And, you know, when they met, we don't know, but I've always imagined they must have just started telling stories from the Eastern Shore. They probably played as children at the same mill on the Tuckahoe River. But by then, she was 3 years older than Douglass. And she had a gig. She had a job working in the home of a well-to-do white family. She got paid enough to, sort of make a living. But they fell in love. He was this strapping 18-year-old, brilliant young guy. They might have met at church. They might have met even at a debating society that Douglas participated in. And she was very involved, we know, in his plot of escape in 1838. And once they are out of Maryland and into New York and on up to New Bedford, as we've discussed, here was this young couple, began having children and trying to make a home in this foreign world of the North and in a free black community. That they grew into very different people says something about their skills, different skills. It says a lot about gender. I mean, what options did an Anna Murray have? People have always wondered why she never learned to read and write, and everyone should be careful with all the possible speculations about that. The truth is we do not know why. What we do know is Douglas, their daughter Rosetta, who was their oldest, and Julia Griffiths, for that matter, all tutored Anna. They tried everything they knew to teach her reading and writing, and it just never worked, for whatever the real reason at the end of the day. We do know that Anna kept the bank book. She was good with numbers. She kept the accounts. We know that from a reminiscence written by the daughter, Rosetta. And of course, early on in this marriage, each other was all they had. So it was no doubt a deep and abiding bond. And then 5 children are born within the course of, about 8 years. And the 5th one, Annie, Anna's namesake, would only live to be 11. She died of diphtheria in 1860 when Douglas was off in England escaping after John Brown's raid. So this is a family, early at least, that is going to have a lot of joy, but a lot of real hardship, and then tragedy as well. But Anna's the one who kept the family together. She's married to this growing intellectual, this man who's trying to read everything he can find, this man who is editing a newspaper, this man who is writing books and essays and editorials and even one novella that the world is taking notice of. I mean, who knows what Anna must have thought about this, but by the middle of the 1850s, she's married to the most famous black man in the world.
And he's on the road constantly. That's becomes very clear during the course of the book and, of course, their life. He is not physically present as a husband or a father. She's left on her own quite a bit. Did you get a sense from his letters or why being physically with his family wasn't a higher priority?
Well, for one thing, it's the way he made a living. Being on the road, itinerant lecturer, getting paid $50 a lecture, and by the way, after the Civil War, he would make $100 to $150 a lecture. That's serious money, especially if you can go on the circuit and do 30 lectures in one trip. So part of that was making a living. Part of that is using his voice. He had adoring relationships with all 4 of his surviving adult children. There's no question about that. We know that from the letters. He could be a very doting father in some ways. He was certainly a doting grandfather later on. He and Anna will end up with 21 grandchildren. And later on, as I discuss in the book at really some length, Douglas's 3 sons, especially 2 of them, and his daughter Rosetta, all had difficult, turbulent lives. Rosetta, in part because she made a very bad marriage to a Civil War veteran, had 7 babies with him in 12 years. I do think there's evidence in my book, and there's certainly evidence laying around out there, that it was never easy to be Frederick Douglass's son and daughter. He became so famous. He had this, he had a real problem with fame, or what we today would call celebrity. They didn't have that word then. And he became eventually the sole financial supporter of most of this huge extended family by the 1870s. Only his oldest son, Louis, by my calculations, was able to really develop an independent life. Everybody else was dependent on him. And we know this because there are quite detailed account books, several of them, that show how much money Douglas is dispersing for this and for that, but it shows particularly how much money he is giving directly to his sons, his son-in-law, and his daughter, and eventually even to his grandchildren.
Frederick Douglass had various relationships with different women, different levels of intimacy. Some of his relationships were professional. He was at Seneca Falls. He knew Susan B. Anthony. He had collaborated with Ida B. Wells during the course of his life. We mentioned earlier Julia. You have a whole chapter, My Faithful Friend Julia. That's Julia Griffith, the British abolitionist. Perhaps the most curious is his relationship with, and I'm going to let you say her name because I'm not sure how to pronounce it.
It's Ottilia Ossing.
Ottilia Ossing, a German-born activist who moves to the States, moves to Hoboken, New Jersey, and essentially moves into Frederick Douglass's life. How would you describe their relationship?
Turbulent, mysterious, and very difficult to explain. Of all the problems to solve in Douglass's biography, and there are several, it's trying to get to the bottom of and explain Ottilia Ossing that was the most difficult of all. Ottilia Ossing was a German 48er. That means she was greatly influenced by the Republican revolutions of 1848. She was a German Jew, although not a practicing Jew. In fact, she was a ferocious atheist. Her father and her mother were writers and poets. In fact, her father had been imprisoned after the Revolution of 48. But she came to America in the early 1850s as a journalist. She was very well educated, extremely well read, fluent in at least 3 languages. But she came to America to cover, as a journalist, the American anti-slavery movement. You know, this slavery issue in America was tearing America apart in the 1850s. And she began to read The Abolitionist. And when she read Douglass's second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, in 1855, she was knocked out of her shoes, so to speak. And only a year later, she traveled out, less than a year later, she traveled out to Rochester, New York, really didn't have an appointment. She just went up to the Douglass home and said, "May I interview you?" And of course he said yes. And well, one thing led to another, but in effect, as you suggested, Allison, she tried never to leave. Now, their relationship would be roughly about 22 years, on and off, on and off. She lived in Hoboken, New Jersey, which was an enclave of German emigres, particularly emigre writers and artists and a couple of scientists. She made a living in part through her journalism, but in part as a teacher. She wrote for a journal in Germany called Der Morgenblatt, where she wrote regular essays, and we have all of those. But she would go out to Rochester, where the Douglasses lived, and spend summers as a sort of friend of the family. Now, we also know that Douglass visited Hoboken on his travels. If you traveled into New York City by train and then traveled south out of New York City, you went through Hoboken. It was a main train depot. Now, she lived in a boarding house. She operated her own salon. She called it her gang. This was a group of anywhere from 5 to 10, mostly German emigres, intellectuals, and they just thought Douglass was the coolest thing that ever happened. Here was this, this dashing, kind of romantic Black American radical, and all of them were trying to be now newly formed American radicals. And he would go, according to Ossing, and spend a night or two there in Hoboken at various times. The problem with this relationship, there are many, but one of them is a source problem. everything we know about the relationship, well, let's say 95% of what we know about it, comes only from her pen, from her letters to her sister that she wrote back to Europe. Her sister Ludmilla lived in various parts of Europe. And we have some of the letters she wrote to Douglas have survived. Not a single letter from him to her survived.
That's interesting.
She burned them all, we believe. Now, we do know she wrote to him a lot because she's always saying, got your letter, I'm glad you said this, what about that? Now, I could go on and on about this. Was it a sexual relationship? Probably. I can't prove even that. And I have a colleague in this field whom I have enormous respect for, Lee Faught, who wrote a book called The Women in the World of Frederick Douglass. It's a brilliant book. I highly recommend it. She doesn't believe it really was a sexual relationship, and we've had wonderful, fun arguments about all that. At the end of the day, it may not matter. What Ossing was, though, clearly, again, not unlike Julia Griffiths had been, she clearly was an intellectual companion. But here's the problem. She was also, and it must be said, as I say in the book, an extraordinarily difficult and arrogant woman. She hated Anna Douglas and said so in these letters to her sister back in Europe, said so in ugly language. She also was very critical of Douglas's adult children, even though she became fairly close with them. She was always wrapping them in these private letters for being, quote, leeches on their father, and so on and so forth. In effect, Ossing, at least in these letters, resented anybody that got between her and Douglas. Mm-hmm. Son, daughter, wife, or anybody else for that matter. And even after Douglas moved to Washington, D.C. in 1872, after his house was burned in Rochester, Ossing still continued to visit in Washington. And she would come and visit for like 3 months at a time and live in the Douglas home. Ossing tried to convince Douglas to go to Europe with her. First, at least to visit, and then to even move there with her. That was never going to happen. Although there's some evidence, at least indirect evidence from Ossing, that he may have led her on a bit. Otherwise, why would she keep insisting on this? Toward the end of this relationship, it actually had, it had worked its way through. Ossing did move back to Europe. Actually, after her sister had died, there was an estate that she received, but she becomes an extraordinarily tragic story. She spent the last few years of her life traveling around Europe with what money she had left. And in early 1884, she had breast cancer at that point, and she knew it, which was a death sentence at that point. And she committed suicide one day in a Paris park. Mm-hmm. But she also left about a $10,000 estate to Douglas and his children. Now, the only expressions we have from Douglas's pen, Douglas wrote thousands of letters and millions of words in his public writings. The only thing we have from Douglas was a letter he wrote after Ossing had died. He called her Miss Ossing. He referred to her as a friend of the family because he had to correspond with a lawyer who was adjudicating this estate. There's also one line in Douglas's third autobiography about Miss Ossing. But other than that, not a word has survived by Douglas about that relationship. We do know she was close to some of the children. It's a difficult, unusual, and probably at times painful relationship for everybody it touched. But there it is.
You're listening to my conversation with David Blight about his biography, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. Up next, we'll continue with a look at Douglas's political life, including his support for the Republican Party, his complicated relationship with Abraham Lincoln, and his terrible meeting with Andrew Johnson at the White House in 1866. You're listening to all of it.